The ubiquitous presence of alcohol in American life is a phenomenon that few substances can rival. It permeates the social, economic, and cultural fabric of the United States in a way that its absence would be, at best, unimaginable. Its presence is evident in moments of celebration and grief, in victories and defeats, in daily rituals and special occasions. The American relationship with alcohol is a paradox in itself, a complex dance between the promise of freedom and the shadow of addiction. Imagine yourself in a packed stadium. The air is charged with energy. The roar of the fans mixes with the scent of popcorn and, inevitably, cold beer. For many, raising a glass of beer is a ritual of belonging, a way to celebrate community, to share the joy of victory or the resignation of defeat. Beer becomes a symbol of camaraderie, of unity around a team, a silent anthem echoing from the stands. Now, take that image to a college campus. Parties are a rite of passage into adulthood. Alcohol, more often than not, is the catalyst. It's the first time many young people find themselves free from family restrictions, and alcohol presents itself as an invitation to freedom and adventure. But behind the euphoria lies a certain fragility. Freedom can turn into excess, and adventure into vulnerability. It's a time of discovery, but also of risk, where socializing gets confused with consumption and the memories of a night can be clouded by recklessness. In a more intimate setting, a glass of wine at the dinner table symbolizes something entirely different. It's a symbol of tradition, of family unity. It's a link that connects generations, a gesture that elevates a dinner to a celebration. An open bottle of wine on a holiday like Thanksgiving or Christmas is not just a beverage, it's a representation of bonds, memories, and a legacy that endures. It's the culture of wine, of toasting, of sharing a meal. Alcohol is even present in symbols of status and success. Advertising is a master at associating drinking with an aspirational lifestyle. Think of whiskey commercials that show successful executives closing deals, or cocktail ads that portray parties on luxurious rooftops. They're not just selling the drink, but the promise of a life of glamour, success, and happiness. The contradiction at the heart of America. Despite its ubiquitous presence and its association with celebration, America's relationship with alcohol is, and always has been, deeply contradictory. It's a reflection of the nation's own duality, which balances the ideal of individual liberty with the challenges of morality and social control. On one hand, there is the exaltation of pleasure, choice, and autonomy. On the other, there is the inevitable shadow of dependence, tragedy, violence, and the silent destruction that alcohol can bring. While the beverage industry makes billions, the social and public health consequences weigh on society. Entire families are torn apart, homes become scenes of suffering, and lives are lost to addiction. The same substance that, in one hand, offers the promise of an unforgettable night, in the other, destroys careers, relationships, and futures. It's a cycle of light and darkness, of celebration and mourning, of conquest and ruin that has been repeating for centuries. To truly understand this, it's not enough to look at consumption statistics or economic data. You have to dive into the stories of ordinary people, of leaders who shaped a nation, of entire communities whose identity was transformed by alcohol. Chapter 1: Colonial Origins and a Historical Necessity. To understand this complex relationship, we must go back to the beginning, to the time of the first colonists. Alcohol wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. The sanitary conditions of the time made water contaminated and dangerous. Beer, rum, and whiskey, having gone through fermentation or distillation processes, were considered safer. Drinking was a common practice across all social classes and on all occasions, from breakfast to the end of a workday. It wasn't just a recreational beverage, but a part of the diet and daily routine. Figures who are now symbols of American liberty were closely linked to the production of beverages. George Washington, the first president, didn't just fight for independence, he was a major whiskey producer. His distillery at Mount Vernon, one of the largest in the country at the time, was not just a hobby, but a profitable economic operation. Thomas Jefferson, another founding father, was passionate about wine. He cultivated vineyards at Monticello and dreamed of establishing an American wine culture that could rival Europe's. For these leaders, alcohol was associated with progress, the economy, and the very American ideal of a self-sufficient and free nation. But the history of alcohol in America isn't just about the great names of its founding. It's, above all, about ordinary people, like Samuel, a Pennsylvania farmer in 1794. For him and his neighbors, whiskey was more than just a drink, it was a means of survival, a form of sustenance. Surplus grains from the harvest, which were difficult to transport and of little value, were converted into whiskey, a product that was easier to sell and store. The distilled liquor served as currency and a store of value. The lives of Samuel and thousands of other farmers changed drastically with the imposition of the whiskey tax, a tax on whiskey enacted by the federal government to pay off debts from the Revolutionary War. For the small producers, the tax seemed like an injustice, a direct threat to their livelihood. The idea that a distant government in Washington could dictate how they should live and tax what they saw as a product of their own land and labor was a powder keg. The reaction was the Whiskey Rebellion. It wasn't just a revolt against the tax, but a cry for liberty. The farmers considered the tax a betrayal of the spirit of the revolution they had helped win. The uprising was not just about money, but about control, autonomy, and identity. The rebellion, which was harshly suppressed by a military force led by George Washington himself, left a deep mark. The episode showed that alcohol was not just a matter of consumption, but a central element of the country's economic, social, and political life. It was, and continues to be, a symbol of freedom, struggle, and resistance. The story of the United States and its relationship with alcohol unfolds as a complex narrative, where the initial story of a substance essential for colonial survival and economy clashes with the dramas of modernity. For the first colonists, alcohol was not just a recreational drink, but a pillar of daily life and prosperity. It represented human ingenuity in transforming basic resources into something more valuable and durable. Imagine, for a moment, the precarious conditions of colonial America. The lack of basic sanitation made water a source of disease. Rivers and wells could be contaminated, and the safest form of hydration came from fermentation. Low-alcohol beer was consumed even by children. It was a matter of public health. Rum, whiskey, and cider became the preferred beverages. In many families, the production of drinks was not a luxury, but a necessity. Whiskey, in particular, took on a central role in the economy of the frontier regions. Far from the major commercial centers, farmers had no way to transport their bulky and perishable grains to market. Whiskey, with its concentration and durability, was the perfect solution. It was a way of bottling wealth, making the harvest easier to transport and sell. Whiskey was, in practice, a universal currency, accepted to pay taxes, buy land, and conduct business. In this context, historical figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were not exceptions, they were reflections of their time. Washington, with his distillery, was not just a mere drinker. He was an entrepreneur, a visionary who understood the crucial role of whiskey in his developing nation's economy. The Mount Vernon distillery was a large-scale enterprise, producing over 11,000 gallons of whiskey per year, solidifying the drink as a symbol of prosperity and progress. Jefferson, with his vineyards, saw viticulture as a path to cultural and economic independence, dreaming of American wines that could compete with France. He saw wine not just as a drink, but as an element of civility and sophistication. However, this narrative of progress and freedom was first confronted with the reality of federal power. The Whiskey Rebellion is a defining moment in the history of the American relationship with alcohol. When the newly formed government imposed a tax on whiskey, it wasn't just taxing a beverage. It was attacking the very foundation of the economy and identity of the farmers of western Pennsylvania. For them, the rebellion was not an act of criminality, but an act of resistance against tyranny. The tax was seen as a violation of the principles they had fought for in the War for Independence. Washington's government, which they had helped create, was now imposing a law that directly harmed them, ignoring their way of life. Whiskey, which had been a symbol of their autonomy, became the battlefield between federal power and individual liberty. The suppression of the rebellion by a military force led by Washington showed that the federal government was willing to use force to ensure its laws were followed. The event, while a victory for the government, left a deep scar. It demonstrated that the American relationship with alcohol would always be marked by a paradox: the celebration of freedom and the need for control. Whiskey, which had been a pillar of survival and the economy, became a symbol of resistance and conflict. And since then, alcohol, in its many forms, would continue to be a barometer of the country's social, economic, and political tensions, shaping its history in ways most people don't even imagine. Chapter 2: The 19th Century and the Rise of Temperance. In the 19th century, as the United States expanded, industrialized, and welcomed millions of immigrants from diverse cultures, its social, cultural, and economic landscape underwent a massive transformation. Alcohol was at the epicenter of many of these changes. This was the century of major industrial growth, mass immigration, and the birth of social movements that would challenge the very fabric of society. A mosaic of cultures and the role of alcohol. The 19th century was an era of unprecedented immigration. Millions of people from different parts of the world arrived on American shores, each group bringing not only their dreams of a better life, but also their own unique traditions and customs. And alcohol, in its many forms, was a central element in these cultures. Germans brought their passion for beer. With them came brewing techniques, beer gardens, social spaces where entire families would gather to drink, talk, and enjoy a sense of community. In cities like Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and St. Louis, German beer became the dominant beverage and a symbol of local identity. Irish immigrants, fleeing the Great Famine, brought whiskey and the tavern as the heart of the community. For these newcomers, taverns were more than just places to drink. They were a refuge, an information center, a job agency, and often the only place where they could feel at home, sharing stories and overcoming the hardships of life in a strange country. For them, alcohol was a way to connect and a temporary escape from adversity. Italians, in turn, brought wine, which was more than just a drink. It was a link to their ancestral heritage, an integral part of family meals and religious celebrations. The glass of wine at the dinner table symbolized continuity, tradition, and respect for the rituals that shaped daily life. This cultural exchange made the presence of alcohol even stronger and more diverse. Taverns, bars, whiskey saloons, and breweries multiplied on every street corner of fast-growing cities. For the new class of industrial workers, with their exhausting 12 or 14-hour workdays and unhealthy conditions, drinking was an escape. It was the quickest and most accessible way to relieve fatigue, pain, and loneliness. Alcohol offered a momentary escape from a harsh reality, a brief moment of euphoria and human connection. The shadow of excess and the cry for change. Despite its social function, widespread alcohol consumption began to be seen as a serious problem. The same drink that brought people together in taverns was also tearing families apart. The already low wages of many men were often spent in bars, leaving their families in poverty. Excessive drinking became the cause of domestic violence, neglect, and abandonment. The American dream of prosperity turned into a nightmare of suffering for countless families. It was against this backdrop of misery and despair that the temperance movement was born and gained strength. led primarily by women, religious leaders, and social reformers, the movement saw alcohol as the root of all social ills. For them, the beverage was public enemy number one, the catalyst for the poverty, crime, and moral decay that threatened the nation. The voice of women like Abigail, a fictional but representative figure of millions, resonated across the country. As a mother of 5 in the 1830s, she personified the pain of alcoholism. Her husband, a factory worker, would give in to his vice, leaving her to care for the family with almost no money. For Abigail and the many other women who joined the movement, the fight against alcohol wasn't just a moral crusade, it was a fight for their family's survival. These women's campaign quickly gained momentum. Temperance clubs sprang up in every town, preaching moderation and, eventually, total abstinence. Public meetings were held, pamphlets were distributed, and fiery sermons echoed in churches, denouncing the evils of alcohol. It was a firm belief that the nation could only prosper if its people learned to abstain from drinking. The 19th century was, therefore, marked by a growing tension. On one side, a flourishing culture of bars, breweries, and taverns. On the other, an increasingly strong moral and social movement that saw sobriety as the only path to progress. This rising conflict would only become more intense in the following decades, culminating in one of the most controversial decisions in American history, Prohibition. The complexity of addiction and the discourse of morality. While the temperance movement was driven by a legitimate concern over the harms of alcohol, it was also based on a simplistic view of the complexity of addiction and social problems. For the reformers, alcoholism was not a disease, but a moral failing, a weakness of character that could be overcome with willpower. This moralistic perspective ignored the social, economic, and psychological factors that led people to drink. For an industrial-era worker, drinking was a form of self-medication against boredom and exploitation. For immigrants, it was a way to find community and comfort in a hostile environment. The temperance message, while effective at mobilizing the masses, often blamed the victim rather than addressing the systemic roots of the problems. It promised that the prohibition of alcohol would solve poverty, crime, and violence. By simplifying the cause and the solution, the movement gained an almost religious momentum. Churches became the main platforms for the campaign, and the message of temperance was conflated with the message of salvation. Moderation, initially defended, was replaced by the radicalism of total prohibition. The 19th century was, therefore, the stage for a cultural battle par excellence. On one side, tradition and pleasure; on the other, reform and moral purification. This tension wasn't limited to speeches and sermons. It manifested in physical confrontations, political lobbying, and the polarization of society. Temperance advocates were seen as the vanguard of progress, while tavern owners and the beverage industries were painted as villains. This cultural and moral battle would shape the political landscape in the following decades, culminating in legislation that would dramatically change the course of American history. The temperance movement, therefore, was more than a campaign against drinking. It was a reflection of the anxieties and hopes of a rapidly changing nation. It represented an attempt to control social chaos through radical moral intervention, a belief that the law could, in fact, mold the character of a people. And the story of what happened next would prove that this belief, though powerful, was deeply mistaken. The era of propaganda and radical activism. As the century progressed, the temperance movement became more sophisticated in its tactics. It was no longer content with local sermons and meetings. It transformed into a powerful machine of propaganda and activism. The Woman's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, founded in 1874, and the Anti-Saloon League, created in 1893, became the two primary forces behind the campaign. The WCTU, under the leadership of figures like Frances Willard, expanded its scope to include other social issues, such as women's suffrage and educational reform. For these women, alcohol prohibition was inseparable from the fight for civil rights. They argued that as long as men spent family money on drinks and women had no political power to protect their homes, society could never be fair. The temperance movement became a catalyst for women's activism, giving a voice to a generation of women who might have otherwise been silenced. The Anti-Saloon League, in contrast, adopted a more focused and politically strategic approach. Instead of preaching abstinence to individuals, the League concentrated on influencing legislation, voting against politicians who did not support the cause and funding campaigns to elect temperance advocates. They were relentless in their goal of passing prohibition laws, first at the local and state levels, and then nationally. The League, ironically, operated as a kind of political machine for morality, demonstrating that the fight against alcohol was, above all, a fight for power. This cultural battle was evident in every aspect of life. Temperance propaganda used shocking images and emotional appeals to dramatize the dangers of drinking. Posters showed shattered families, men turning into beasts, and starving children, all because of a glass of alcohol. The rhetoric was Manichaean: alcohol was the absolute evil, and sobriety, the supreme good. The science and medicine of the time, still in their infancy regarding addiction, were often twisted to support the prohibitionist cause. Meanwhile, the culture of bars and taverns continued to thrive, especially in large cities. For immigrants and workers, the bar was a refuge, a place where loneliness was exchanged for camaraderie. Saloon owners, many of them immigrants themselves, saw themselves as providers of an essential service, offering a space for socializing and, often, credit and help to those in need. The tavern was a central institution in urban life, and efforts to close it were seen as an attack on personal liberty and culture. The tension between these two worlds, the tavern culture and the temperance crusade, would continue to grow. American society became increasingly polarized, divided between those who saw the freedom to drink as a fundamental right and those who saw prohibition as the only way to save the nation from its moral self-destruction. This dispute, which grew more heated by the day, would set the stage for the largest and most controversial social experiment in American history: Prohibition. Chapter 3: Prohibition and the Ultimate Contradiction. In Chapter 3, we enter the most controversial and paradoxical era of America's relationship with alcohol: Prohibition. The early 20th century was marked by increasing pressure from the temperance movement, which, after decades of activism, finally saw its victory materialize. A coalition of religious groups, social reformers, and conservative politicians achieved what seemed impossible: the nationwide ban on alcohol. Prohibition, a moral utopia in theory. In 1920, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, kicking off Prohibition. The law made the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal throughout the country. In theory, Prohibition was the perfect solution to society's ills. Its advocates, including the powerful Anti-Saloon League, believed that a lack of alcohol would dramatically reduce violence, stabilize families, make workers more productive, and restore society's morality. It was a vision of a purified nation, free from vice and depravity. Alcohol, seen as the root of all evil, would be eradicated, and America would become a beacon of virtue for the world. On paper, the plan was logical and promising. Prohibition represented the triumph of morality over vice, of control over chaos. It was believed that by removing the temptation, addiction would simply disappear. The reality of Prohibition: the clandestine chaos. However, the reality was dramatically different. Prohibition didn't eliminate the desire for alcohol, it just drove it underground. The demand for drinks remained strong, and with the law of supply and demand in full effect, illegal activity became a multi-billion-dollar business. Before long, speakeasies, secret bars, popped up in every city. To get in, you had to whisper a secret password, and inside was a world of jazz, illegal cocktails, and an atmosphere of excitement and rebellion. Instead of eliminating crime, Prohibition fueled it on an unprecedented scale. Vice and violence didn't decrease, they simply changed hands. Organized crime saw a golden opportunity. Mobs like Al Capone's in Chicago and other gangs in New York, Detroit, and Kansas City got rich by controlling the clandestine production and distribution of alcohol. Smuggling, known as bootlegging, became a massive operation, with trucks of liquor crossing borders and ships transporting rum from the Caribbean islands. While the law's supporters celebrated a moral victory, in the streets, gang violence, political corruption, and scandals grew at an alarming rate. The war for territory and control of the illegal alcohol market resulted in massacres and murders that shocked the nation. The police themselves, instead of enforcing the law, were often bribed and protected the criminals. Alcohol, which should have disappeared, was now consumed in an even more dangerous form, and drinkers often had no idea what they were consuming, as the drinks were mixed with toxic substances. Alcohol is a symbol of rebellion. Imagine a young person like Robert in 1925, frequenting a speakeasy in New York. For him, drinking during Prohibition wasn't just an act of pleasure, but an act of rebellion, almost a form of cultural protest. The clandestine bars were the backdrop for the cultural revolution of the Roaring Twenties, with jazz music, sensual dances, and a new attitude of freedom and disrespect for authority. There, alcohol was no longer just a drink, it became a symbol of resistance against a law seen as oppressive and moralistic. Prohibition, instead of stifling consumption, made it more attractive and glamorous, especially for the youth. This contradiction revealed a painful lesson: you can't simply erase a centuries-old cultural practice with a decree. Alcohol was part of the American identity, and the attempt to ban it only fueled illegality, violence, and hypocrisy. Prohibition was an attempt to impose virtue, but the result was a nation that was more corrupt and divided. The idealism of temperance collided with the reality of human nature and market demand, creating a landscape where crime flourished. The end of Prohibition and its legacy. After 13 years of resounding failure, Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment. The decision came in the midst of the Great Depression, and the repeal was seen as a way to create jobs and raise tax revenue on alcohol, which would help the collapsing economy. With the end of Prohibition, alcohol once again circulated legally, but now it carried a legacy of crime, corruption, and a deep distrust of authority. The repeal was, in a way, an admission that Prohibition had been a monumental mistake. The experience of Prohibition left an indelible mark on American history, shaping the country's relationship with alcohol for decades. Prohibition failed in its main objective and, instead, created a criminal underworld, demoralized law enforcement, and turned alcohol consumption into an act of cultural defiance. And while alcohol became legal again, the tension between the freedom of consumption and the dangers of addiction would remain a central issue in American society. Chapter 4: Post-Prohibition: Rebuilding in the Culture of the Toast. With the end of Prohibition in 1933, the United States witnessed an unprecedented cultural, economic, and social transformation. Alcohol, which for 13 years had been relegated to the underground, now returned to the streets, to dinner tables, and to bars, but this time under a new system, government-regulated and, most importantly, taxed. This return wasn't just about freeing up the beverage, it was a political and economic strategy. The country was still struggling to recover from the devastating effects of the Great Depression, and alcohol taxes emerged as a vital source of revenue for public coffers. Distilleries, breweries, and wineries that had been shut down or forced into illegality reopened their doors with renewed vigor. Within a few weeks, thousands of jobs were created, from factory workers to bartenders and musicians. For many Americans, drinking in public again wasn't just about pleasure, it was the feeling that normalcy had returned. But the return didn't mean innocence. If during Prohibition alcohol had become a symbol of rebellion and glamour, in the post-Prohibition era, it became an element of national unity, identity, and celebration. America learned to toast as if celebrating its own survival. Helen, the bartender who saw the change. In the heart of New York, Helen, a young bartender who had worked in speakeasies during the Prohibition years, felt this contrast every day. Before, she used to hide in the back of dimly lit bars, serving makeshift cocktails while constantly looking toward the door, fearing the police. Now, with legalization, Helen worked in a bright bar with live music and tables full of customers laughing without the fear of being arrested. But freedom had two sides. While Helen no longer had to take risks, she also witnessed something darker: unbridled consumption and the quiet consequences of alcohol. There were men who came in smiling and left being carried out by their friends, women who unburdened themselves about abusive husbands, young people who drank as if the glass were a passport to adulthood. Helen noticed that despite its new legality, alcohol still carried the same tragedies as before, only now they were in plain sight. The birth of modern alcohol advertising. Legalization opened the door for a phenomenon that would shape generations: advertising. With the industry free to market again, campaigns began that transformed alcohol into much more than a simple drink. It was sold as a lifestyle. Magazines, radio, and later, television, flooded homes with images of elegant men holding whiskey glasses, smiling women toasting with champagne, and families gathered around a table where beer held a prominent place. Alcohol became associated with masculinity, charm, financial success, and even the idea of marital happiness. If excessive drinking was once seen as a vice, advertising set about creating the image of responsible consumption, even while always showing the drinks in glamorous contexts. The result was a normalization. In just a few years, grabbing a beer at a barbecue or opening a bottle of wine at dinner stopped being a luxury and became a daily habit. The culture of the backyard and the stadium. With the end of Prohibition, alcohol left its hidden corners and moved to the center of American celebrations. The backyard barbecue, one of the symbols of suburban culture in the 40s and 50s, rarely happened without a case of cold beers. The baseball stadium, considered the national pastime, became a stage for massive beer consumption. Drinking was no longer just a matter of individual pleasure, but of collective identity. It was as if opening a bottle meant taking part in an American tradition. Every toast was more than a social gesture. It was a reaffirmation that freedom had triumphed over restriction, and that the United States was once again the master of its own culture. The invisible effects. But, as Helen well understood, there was a price to pay. The triumphant return of alcohol also brought a rise in alcoholism, domestic violence, and traffic accidents. Data from the era already showed that hospitals were seeing a growing number of cases related to alcohol abuse. Many Americans who previously had no access to alcohol began to experiment and turn consumption into a daily habit. Addiction, now more visible, stopped being a hidden problem and became a public health issue. It was in this context that the first awareness movements emerged, such as the expansion of Alcoholics Anonymous, founded in 1935, which sought to offer support to those who found themselves trapped in the cycle of dependence. Alcohol is a cultural icon. Over the following years, alcohol cemented itself not just as a product, but as a cultural icon. Hollywood played a fundamental role in this process. In films, drinking was an act of charm. Humphrey Bogart holding a glass of whiskey in Casablanca, Marilyn Monroe smiling with a drink in hand, or James Bond ordering his famous martini, shaken, not stirred. These images not only reflected but also shaped behavior. Thousands of young people imitated their idols, believing that drinking brought them closer to the glamour of the movies. Alcohol, which had been a symbol of rebellion against prohibition, was now a symbol of sophistication and social belonging. The moral dilemma of a new era. American society began to live with a contradiction. On one hand, It celebrated the return of freedom and the commerce of alcohol. On the other, it faced the side effects of that very same consumption. Churches and conservative groups warned of the dangers of excess, while the industry continued to invest in increasingly creative campaigns to win over new audiences. It was a clash of forces: public health versus the market, morality versus individual liberty, control versus pleasure. This tension would run through the entire 20th century and remains to this day. Final reflection. The end of Prohibition didn't just mean the return of a forbidden substance. It represented the birth of a new relationship between the United States and alcohol, a mix of celebration, cultural identity, and, at the same time, silent dependence. Every open bottle brought two possible stories: one of the collective joy of a toast and one of the individual pain of those lost to addiction. Between these two narratives, the American culture of alcohol was built, a pillar that would cross generations, marking parties, family gatherings, and major national events, but also hospitals, broken homes, and interrupted lives. Chapter 5: The 50s to the 70s, Family, Parties, and Rebellion. After World War II, the United States experienced a social and economic transformation that would shape future decades. The economy was booming, suburban neighborhoods were growing rapidly, and American society sought stability and comfort after years of global conflict. During this period, family life became the national ideal: the perfect American home, the backyard barbecue, the abundant Sunday dinner, the smiles of children growing up in safety. And almost inevitably, alcohol was woven into this new reality, becoming a constant presence at family gatherings, holiday meals, and small, everyday celebrations. Beer, wine, and more discreetly, whiskey, became symbols of togetherness, ritualizing moments of unity. Every toast at a sunset barbecue or every glass raised on a Saturday night carried the feeling of newfound normalcy and prosperity. But alcohol also became a tool for escapism, a release valve for tensions built up after the war, and for the pressures of a new suburban lifestyle, marked by diligent work and the expectation of a perfect family. Imagine David, a 16-year-old in 1965, living in a Chicago suburb. The rows of houses, clean streets, and schools packed with extracurricular activities created a scene of safety and prosperity. But, like all adolescents, there was room for experimentation, for testing limits, for finding oneself in the world. For David and his friends, Saturday night parties weren't just about fun, they were rites of passage. Alcohol, whether consumed discreetly or excessively, was the key to unlocking this newfound freedom, a way to fit in with social circles and symbolically challenge their parents' authority. For many young people at the time, getting drunk was seen as a test of courage. That stolen glass of wine from the kitchen or the beer bottle hidden in the cabinet turned into a social initiation. It wasn't just about pleasure, it was about belonging, identity, a silent affirmation: I'm part of something bigger than my own home. The two sides of freedom. However, as history often shows, freedom never comes without consequences. Many adolescents who experimented with alcohol began to face problems while still in their teens. Car accidents, fights at parties, early signs of dependency, and family conflicts became more common. Even though parents often gave them freedom and trust, what was once considered a simple pastime started to prove dangerous. Binge drinking, the excessive consumption of alcohol in a short period, began to emerge as a real social issue, but it was still invisible to many adults, hidden in the shadows of party lights and student gatherings. Meanwhile, advertising and the media began to play a central role in shaping the perception of alcohol. Commercials showed young adults on lively dates, parties full of laughter, sunny backyard barbecues, and football games with a beer in hand. Alcohol was no longer just a beverage, it became synonymous with glamour, freedom, success, and social connection. The message was clear: drinking was modern, desirable, and part of the process of building an American identity. Consumption ceased to be just a personal matter and became a cultural one. And it wasn't just advertising. Movies and music reinforced these ideals. Teen films showed characters drinking to have fun, win over a love interest, or assert themselves socially. Popular songs celebrated alcohol as a symbol of rebellion and pleasure. Each cultural reference solidified the idea that drinking was natural, desirable, and even necessary for social life, creating a cycle where young people learned that alcohol was not just allowed, but essential for belonging to society. The enduring dilemma. But this normalization was accompanied by invisible risks. Universities became epicenters of excessive consumption, with fraternities and student clubs promoting alcohol-fueled parties where social pressure dictated the limits. Many young people found themselves consuming large amounts of alcohol without realizing the impact on their physical, emotional, and social health. There was a permanent tension between freedom and risk, between pleasure and danger. On one hand, alcohol represented the expression of a generation seeking autonomy, new experiences, and fun. On the other, it carried profound consequences, including accidents, illnesses, and family problems. This tension was reflected in every party, every toast, every social gathering. The same gesture that symbolized freedom could also signal impending danger. Furthermore, society at the time was still dealing with striking contradictions. Churches, schools, and community groups warned about the risks of alcohol, while the media, cinema, and advertising continued to glamorize it. This duality between morality and popular culture shaped the way American society would view alcohol in the following decades, a mix of celebration and caution, pleasure and responsibility, freedom and limitation. The story of David, and thousands of young people like him, exemplifies this complexity. Every party, every shared drink, every moment of euphoria had a shadow, accidents, conflicts, and silent addiction. The freedom to experiment came with the need to learn, to protect oneself, to understand limits. The social life of American youth was intrinsically linked to this experience, creating patterns that would influence generations. The period from the 50s to the 70s, therefore, was marked by a dual culture, the construction of a social identity around alcohol, and the growing perception of its risks. This era molded the future of consumption in the United States, establishing traditions, habits, and dilemmas that would endure for decades to come. The tension between celebration and danger, freedom and responsibility, became a central characteristic of the American relationship with drinking. In the end, the 50s to the 70s show us that alcohol is more than a substance, it's a mirror of society, reflecting its values, fears, desires, and contradictions. It enabled moments of unity, fun, and personal expression, but it also exposed vulnerabilities, creating dilemmas that would continue to challenge families, young people, and communities. Every toast had multiple layers of meaning, and every party carried with it the shadow of consequences not yet fully visible. Chapter 6: The 80s to the 2000s, Consumption, Advertising, and Normalization. With the arrival of the 1980s, the United States was in the midst of a social and cultural transformation that would profoundly impact how alcohol was consumed and perceived. The economy was strengthening, globalization was beginning to intensify, and communication technology was connecting cities and cultures in unprecedented ways. Against this backdrop, the alcohol industry reached new heights of professionalism, marketing, and cultural influence. Major brands invested heavily in sophisticated advertising, using television, radio, magazines, and later, emerging media to reach different audiences. Each campaign aimed to transform alcohol into more than just a drink. It became a symbol of sophistication, success, freedom, and social belonging. Alcohol was no longer just consumed, it was desired, admired, and aspired to. The invisible path to dependence. Imagine Laura, a young professional in New Jersey, living through the 90s. Laura was socially active, frequenting bars, parties, happy hours, and corporate events. Alcohol was present in almost all of her social interactions, serving as a tool for integration, networking, and even for relieving accumulated work stress. Initially, drinking was a harmless social act, part of a routine that seemed normal and balanced. However, over time, her consumption began to become problematically invisible. Laura started to depend on drinking to relax, to feel confident, and to cope with external pressures. Her friends and family didn't notice, and she herself didn't recognize the silent path toward dependence. Laura's experience wasn't isolated. Millions of Americans lived through similar situations. Social and culturally accepted consumption, when combined with individual factors of stress and anxiety, often evolved into harmful patterns. This era showed that the normalization of alcohol, promoted by advertising, movies, and social life, could camouflage dangerous effects that, invisible at first glance, deeply impacted lives. A duality of messages. Meanwhile, the first large-scale awareness movements began to emerge. Prevention campaigns against drunk driving became mandatory in schools, on university campuses, and on radio stations. Community programs encouraged education about the risks of excessive drinking and promoted support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, offering paths to recovery and reflection. Despite this, there was a clear paradox. Society warned about the dangers of alcohol, but advertising continued to glamorize its consumption, creating a lasting cultural tension between pleasure and danger. Cinema and television played a fundamental role in solidifying alcohol as a cultural icon. Popular movies and TV shows depicted characters drinking in a glamorous and socially admirable way. James Bond sipping martinis in long spy scenes, young adults frequenting bars on Friends or Beverly Hills, 90,210, and celebrities on magazine covers with glasses of champagne. All of it reinforced the idea that drinking was synonymous with elegance, independence, and sociability. Alcohol was no longer a social necessity. It became a symbol of identity, prestige, and cultural status. The period between the 80s and 2000 also witnessed changes in collective behavior. Corporate offices included after-work happy hours, bars in small and medium-sized cities thrived, and family and community parties often had alcohol as their central element. The beverage permeated all aspects of social life, establishing itself as part of the everyday American experience. Pleasure, risk, and the American identity. But as consumption became culturally acceptable, the risks didn't disappear. Binge drinking continued to be a problem in universities. Young adults faced social pressure to drink, and alcohol-related car accidents remained high. Epidemiological studies from the time showed that the glamour in advertising created a perception of safety and normalcy, but the statistical reality remained concerning. Addiction, violence, and health problems were closely linked to this culture of consumption. Imagine Mark, a young advertising executive in Los Angeles in the 90s, who closely followed the multi-million-dollar campaigns for beer and whiskey brands. For him, alcohol was part of his job and his lifestyle, but he also witnessed the negative effects of excessive partying, colleagues affected by dependence, and accidents involving friends. Mark's experience shows how alcohol, even when glamorized and culturally accepted, maintains a profound duality. Pleasure and danger coexist side by side. This era also showed the impact of new media and technology. With the expansion of cable television, audience segmentation made advertising even more effective, strategically targeting messages to young people, adults, and professionals. Brands created their own identities, using colors, slogans, and images that associated consumption with freedom, rebellion, or sophistication. Alcohol thus became part of the construction of personal identity, reinforcing cultural and social expectations that would span generations. The period from 1980 to 2000 highlights a central contradiction in American society. Alcohol is celebrated as part of social and cultural life, but it simultaneously represents a silent risk, invisible to many until it's too late. The normalization and glamorization of consumption go hand in hand with serious consequences, revealing the complexity of the American relationship with the beverage. In the end, this era shows that alcohol is part of cultural and social identity but cannot be treated as a neutral element. Glamour and addiction coexist, and freedom and responsibility are balanced in a constant tension. The perception of pleasure must always be accompanied by an awareness of risk. The decades that cemented alcohol as a cultural symbol also showed that the dangers, often invisible, remain present, shaping behaviors and impacting lives on a profound level. Chapter 7: The 21st Century, Contradictions and Challenges. In the modern era, the United States navigates an extremely complex and contradictory relationship with alcohol. The beverage remains a constant presence in social and cultural life, accessible, regulated, and integrated into parties, family gatherings, sporting events, and even work environments. Yet, at the same time, it represents one of the country's greatest public health challenges. Recent data indicates that over 140,000 Americans die annually from alcohol-related causes, whether from liver disease, drunk driving accidents, or long-term complications. The economic impact is also devastating. Billions of dollars are spent on healthcare services, prevention programs, addiction treatment, and lost workplace productivity. Imagine Michael, a father from Ohio, who lost his teenage son in an accident caused by a drunk driver. For him, every beer ad, every wine commercial, or every party where drinking is the center of celebration is a painful reminder that one individual's freedom can have devastating consequences for others. Every toast, every ad campaign, every seemingly innocent gesture takes on a new dimension of risk, responsibility, and the memory of loss. Michael represents one of the many American stories that illustrate the dark side of the relationship with alcohol, a relationship that combines pleasure, culture, and tragedy in unsettling proportions. On the other hand, there are stories of resilience and hope. Sarah, a young woman from New York, faced years of alcohol dependence that affected her health, family relationships, and professional life. With the support of groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, rehabilitation programs, and her own network of family and friends, Sarah managed to break free from her addiction and rebuild her life. Her story is a reminder that despite the risks and alarming statistics, recovery is possible. The 21st century has brought significant advances in medical treatments, prevention programs, and awareness campaigns, but the battle against the negative effects of alcohol remains constant and requires continuous vigilance. New habits and ongoing dangers. Beyond health and addiction issues, new forms of consumption and new alcohol-related cultures have emerged. The rise of e-commerce for alcohol, for instance, has made different products more accessible, allowing anyone over the legal drinking age to order wine, beer, or spirits directly to their home. The explosion of the craft beer culture, with its themed bars, tasting festivals, and mixology workshops, has transformed consumption into a cultural and social experience. Alcohol is a celebration again, but now with nuances of sophistication and exclusivity, very different from the widespread consumption of previous eras. However, every technological and cultural advance brings new challenges. Easier access means that young people may experiment with drinks before the legal age, increasing the risk of binge drinking, traffic accidents, and risky behaviors. Tasting events and sophisticated parties, while seemingly harmless, can camouflage patterns of excessive consumption, while the influence of social media reinforces the normalization of alcohol as a symbol of status, fun, and belonging. American society, therefore, lives with a permanent duality. Alcohol is, at the same time, a symbol of freedom, celebration, culture, and identity, and a factor of risk, dependence, and tragedy. This tension defines the country's relationship with the beverage today and illustrates a profound cultural paradox. Celebrating can mean danger, one person's freedom can affect the lives of others, and socializing can hide silent addictions. This contradiction is visible in different contexts. On college campuses, alcohol-fueled parties continue to be part of the social ritual, and binge drinking among students is still a significant concern. In the corporate world, happy hours and networking events with alcoholic beverages are common, showing that alcohol remains an intrinsic part of adult social life. At family parties and holidays, drinking is still a guaranteed presence, but it's now often accompanied by campaigns promoting responsible consumption. A culture of contradiction. At the same time, the media continues to reinforce glamorous images of consumption. Celebrities, movies, TV shows, and social media portray alcohol as synonymous with sophistication, fun, and personal success, maintaining a cultural cycle that promotes pleasure while simultaneously concealing the risks. Every commercial or celebrity post showing people toasting or drinking during happy moments reinforces the idea that alcohol is essential for entertainment and socializing. The 21st century has also brought greater awareness of the social impacts of alcohol. Non-governmental organizations, state and federal governments have developed educational programs, anti-drunk driving campaigns, health awareness initiatives, and provided easier access to treatment programs. But even with these efforts, the challenges remain. The popularization of craft alcoholic beverages, themed events, and the digital normalization of consumption increase the risks and make social and individual control more difficult. Thus, alcohol in the 21st century continues to be a symbol of duality. It is both culture and risk, celebration and tragedy, freedom and responsibility. The experiences of individuals like Michael and Sarah illustrate how this duality manifests in real life, affecting families, communities, and American society as a whole. Every toast, every event, every advertising campaign carries multiple meanings: joy, identity, pleasure, but also a warning, a need for care, and a consequence. The challenge for contemporary society is to learn to live with this duality consciously, to enjoy moments of celebration without neglecting the risks, to promote the culture of alcohol without ignoring the dangers, and to teach freedom without allowing it to become destruction. This tension defines, more than ever, the United States' relationship with alcohol, reminding us that behind every toast, there are stories of pleasure and stories of loss, often invisibly intertwined. Chapter 8, Final Reflection. The history of alcohol in the United States is, above all, a narrative of extremes and contrasts. From the early colonists who grew vineyards and distilled whiskey for survival, to contemporary youth facing social pressures and relentless marketing, the beverage has shaped behaviors, traditions, and the very cultural identity of the country. It is a journey marked by freedom and restriction, by glamour and destruction, by immense profit and silent suffering. Alcohol has never just been a drink, it is a reflection of American society, of its values, desires, fears, and contradictions. Each chapter of this history reveals a persistent duality. In the early colonial times, figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson saw alcohol as a tool for sustenance, an economic resource, and simultaneously, a symbol of status and autonomy. In the Whiskey Rebellion, whiskey was transformed into a form of protest currency, showing that a beverage could be both an instrument of survival and of social conflict. Centuries later, during Prohibition, alcohol became a symbol of rebellion and resistance to oppression, but also of violence, illegality, and family destruction. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, drinking was integrated into suburban life, teenage parties, and family rituals. For young people like David, alcohol symbolized freedom, social identity, and belonging, but at the same time, it carried invisible risks, accidents, early signs of dependence, and family conflicts. In the 80s and 90s, Laura and millions of Americans experienced the power of advertising, television, cinema, and pop culture to create desires, habits, and consumption patterns that often turned into silent addiction. In the 21st century, the duality has only intensified. People like Michael witness tragedies caused by drinking, while Sarah shows that it is possible to overcome the devastating effects of addiction with support, treatment, and resilience. New forms of consumption, the craft beer culture, tasting events, and online sales have made alcohol more present and sophisticated, but also more accessible and potentially dangerous, especially for young people. Alcohol is simultaneously a symbol of celebration, culture, and pleasure, as well as a factor of risk, dependence, and tragedy. Every toast, every party, every ad campaign is not just an isolated act, it's part of a collective history that mixes triumphs and losses, pleasure and destruction, freedom and limitation. Alcohol enables moments of unity, socialization, and fun, but it also comes with an invisible price. Families are affected, lives can be interrupted, and silent addictions develop, often without anyone noticing. This invisible tension is an essential part of the American experience with drinking. The final reflection, therefore, is deeper than numbers, statistics, or studies. To understand the United States' relationship with alcohol is to recognize its real impact on people's lives, on public health, on communities, and on culture. Alcohol is part of the national identity, but also a constant reminder that freedom and responsibility go hand in hand, that every celebration has consequences, and that every individual choice can affect lives in unexpected ways. Over the centuries, the country has learned, in painful and profound ways, that the glorification of a beverage does not eliminate the risks and that complete repression also doesn't solve social dilemmas. The challenge is in finding balance, celebrating without getting lost, toasting without destroying, integrating alcohol into social life without allowing it to dominate, harm, or silence. It's a delicate balance that requires historical awareness, personal responsibility, and constant reflection. The question that remains is unsettling and without a single answer: what will be the future of this relationship? Is it possible to maintain the celebration and culture of alcohol without repeating the mistakes of the past? Can the freedom to drink coexist with safety, health, and the preservation of family and social relationships? The 21st century demands that this question be asked with every toast, every party, and every ad campaign, reminding us that alcohol is, at the same time, part of the American identity and a permanent challenge of consciousness and responsibility. America's history with alcohol is not just a narrative about a beverage, but about society itself, its values, contradictions, and choices. It is a living, constantly evolving story that blends pleasure and danger, freedom and limits, culture and risk. And it is in this complexity that the most important lesson lies. Alcohol can be celebrated, enjoyed, and integrated into social life, but always with mindfulness, respect, and awareness. The country continues to learn, generation after generation, that every toast carries multiple meanings, and that true celebration is only complete when freedom and responsibility walk side by side.